Attorney General Ellison, under your watch, unfortunately, Minnesota has achieved the largest COVID fraud scheme in American history. Under your watch, those whistleblowers who brought attention to the fraud and waste in your state faced retaliation. Under your watch, billions of tax dollars intended for unemployment insurance, supporting hungry children, just as described, children with autism, providing housing for the most vulnerable, keeping small businesses afloat through COVID, and more were instead, all of those dollars were funneled away into fraudulent schemes. So last month in an interview with CNN, you were asked if your office has done enough to stop the fraud. And you responded, "Of course we've done enough." And this is a quote, "Of course we've done enough. And we're doing more every single day. This is a political matter. This is not a serious thing." Those are your words.
That is an absolutely brutal way to open a hearing because it does two things at once. First, it puts the scale of the failure right on the table. Not a minor paperwork issue, not a technical glitch, a massive fraud scandal tied to programs that were supposed to help people during a crisis. Second, it takes Ellison's own words and turns them into evidence against him. And that's why this lands so hard. When a public official says a giant fraud problem is not a serious thing, that's not just a bad soundbite. That's a window into the mindset. It tells voters, taxpayers, and every would-be scammer listening exactly how seriously the people in charge took the threat. This is what made the exchange so damaging. Senator Joni Ernst didn't walk in there trying to score some cute viral moment. She walked in with a very simple argument. Regular people work too hard and pay too much for government to shrug when their money disappears into obvious fraud. And once that argument is framed that clearly, the excuses start sounding very small, very fast. That's the bigger story here. This wasn't just about one politician getting grilled. It was about whether anybody in power is actually willing to admit the system failed, or whether they'll keep hiding behind bureaucracy, politics, and technicalities while the public gets stuck with the bill. And if you like commentary that cuts through the spin and gets straight to the point, hit like, subscribe, and drop your take in the comments because this one deserves a real conversation. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this, because stories like this are exactly why oversight matters. Before Ernst even gets into Ellison directly, she sets the tone in a way that matters. She doesn't start with a spreadsheet. She starts with the people footing the bill. That's smart, because fraud in government always gets buried under sterile language, improper payments, administrative issues, program failures. But the reality is much simpler than that. Somebody works for that money. Somebody sends it to Washington. Somebody trusts the system to do at least the bare minimum, and then somebody in power acts shocked when the public gets angry after watching billions get burned.
I come from a blue-collar working family, a farm family. My parents farmed, they worked very hard. Their parents ahead of them worked very hard to get where we are today. I'm very privileged to sit in this seat today. My sister works for a trucking company. She and her husband farm. My brother is a blue-collar labor union worker for the railroad. Every one of their tax dollars needs to be protected because they work darn hard in all types of weather. They work outside. They don't have the privilege of sitting in a cushy office working 9 to 5. But what we have found in the federal government through years and years of the work that I have done on oversight is that 1 out of every $10 that Americans send to the federal government is squandered away and lost in fraud. We have seen examples like the Quality Layering Center in Minnesota recently, but this is happening in every single state.
And that right there is the frame Ellison never really escapes, because once you make it about the welder, the trucker, the farmer, the rail worker, the family scraping by through inflation and taxes, the usual political dodge stops working. You can't look those people in the eye and say, well, technically, this is complicated. They already know it's complicated. That's the problem. The system is so complicated that it becomes a perfect hiding place for failure. easier. And there's another reason Ernst's setup works. It kills the favorite defense of every entrenched official, pretending public outrage is just partisan theater. No, people don't need a campaign consultant to tell them fraud is bad. They don't need a talking point memo to understand that money meant for children, small businesses, housing, and emergency relief should not end up in fraudulent schemes. Normal people understand that instantly. The only people who struggle to say it clearly are the ones who might own part of the mess. Then Ernst strips everything down to one sentence.
Attorney General Ellison, under your watch, unfortunately, Minnesota has achieved the largest COVID fraud scheme in American history.
That's the line. That's the indictment. Under your watch, not under the weather. Not under abstract forces, not under some mysterious act of nature, under your watch. And that phrase matters because public office comes with two things politicians love to separate when it benefits them: credit and responsibility. When things go right, everybody wants their name on the ribbon cutting, the press release, and the applause line. But when things go wrong at scale, suddenly nobody had authority, nobody saw it coming, nobody could have known, and everyone was waiting on someone else to move first. That's the game. Ernst is basically saying, you don't get to enjoy the power and then disappear when accountability shows up. Now here's where Ellison tries to shift the conversation away from that core point. Instead of meeting the criticism head on, he reaches for the classic politician survival kit. Praise the concern, say you agree in principle, and then start drawing procedural boundaries around what you supposedly can't do.
How do I go back to my hardworking brother and my hardworking sister and every other American who's going out there and then sending their taxpayer dollars to Washington, D.C., only to have it squandered away in fraud? How do we respond to them? And how do we recoup those dollars from these programs that Minnesota should have been overseeing?
Senator Ernst, thank you. I really do believe that you're sincerely, earnestly trying to look out for taxpayer dollars. And I'm here to tell you that, of course, we're here to hold people accountable who commit fraud. I've prosecuted and convicted over 300 people since I've been the AG for Medicaid fraud. So I'm with you when you're trying to protect the public dollar. What I was saying in that interview is that rather than coming together on a bipartisan basis to stop fraud, the matter has been turned into a political football, which I bet you probably would agree it shouldn't be. We should come together to protect the public dollar, and it shouldn't be somebody's campaign ad. What we should do is do it together. So what are we doing? First of all, you should know that I can only prosecute crimes that the county attorney gives me or that the governor assigns me. I do not have authority to just prosecute anybody I want.
This is where the answer starts to fall apart. Because notice what happens here. He doesn't really refute the central criticism. He reframes it. He shifts from, did your state fail massively under your watch, to can we all agree fraud is bad and politics is ugly? That's a very different conversation. Of course fraud is bad. Of course both parties can posture. But none of that answers the basic question. Why should the public trust the people overseeing these programs when the fraud became this enormous and the rhetoric coming from the top sounded dismissive? And then comes the move that really tells on the whole strategy, the authority defense. Now, to be fair, legal jurisdiction matters. It does. Government is full of overlapping lanes, and not every official can unilaterally do everything. That part is true, but that truth gets abused all the time, because there's a difference between saying, I literally could not sign this exact charging document myself, and saying, therefore I bear no meaningful responsibility for how this scandal unfolded. Those are not the same thing. That's why this answer felt so thin. Ellison wasn't some outsider who stumbled onto a broken system last week. He was part of the political environment surrounding this for years. And once that context gets added back in, the my hands were tied defense starts sounding a lot less like principle and a lot more like escape. The most politically damaging part of this whole story is that it feeds a suspicion voters already have, that officials only discover the limits of their power after they've been caught flat-footed. Before the scandal, everybody's decisive. After the scandal, everybody's a process expert. And if you missed the line that probably did the most work for him in that exchange, here it is again in its most distilled form.
I can only prosecute crimes that the county attorney gives me or that the governor assigns me. I do not have authority to just prosecute anybody I want.
Yeah.
That sentence is supposed to close the case. Instead, it opens a bigger one up because once you say that out loud in a hearing like this, people immediately start asking the obvious follow-up. Okay, then where were the warnings? Where was the urgency? Where was the public pressure? Where was the coordination? Where was the alarm? If your authority was limited, what did you do with the authority you did have? Did you raise hell? Did you push every lever available? Did you act like this was the emergency it became? Or did you treat it like an annoyance until the scandal got too big to ignore? That's why Ernst's use of Ellison's prior media comments hurts so much. It isn't just that she caught him on a bad phrase, it's that the tone of those comments lines up with the suspicion people already had. The problem was not treated with the seriousness it deserved. And this is also where the Tim Walz angle starts hanging in the air whether Ellison wants it to or not. The minute he says he needs cases handed off or assigned, he's no longer standing there as the isolated target. He's pointing up the chain, sideways across the system, and basically implying that responsibility was shared. Politically, that might be understandable, but optically, it looks like exactly what voters hate, when the circle of accountability gets bigger and bigger until nobody inside it is ever truly accountable. Now, the defense of people like Ellison is always that critics are oversimplifying a complex system. Fine, systems are complex, but fraudsters count on that complexity. They thrive in the space between agencies, between offices, between legal thresholds, between who should have acted and who says they couldn't. That gap is where the money disappears, which is why the next part of the hearing matters so much. Ernst turns from blame to structure and asks the question that should have been asked years ago. How do you build incentives so states actually guard the money once it leaves Washington?
Too often the federal government writes a check and then looks the other way. How should Congress redesign incentives to ensure states have real skin in the game and safeguards taxpayer dollars once those funds have left Washington, D.C.?
Well, thank you, Senator. And you're absolutely right that people respond to incentives, and especially immoral people respond to incentives. And unfortunately, we've had both in federal programs, but especially the way the Walz administration and Attorney General Ellison have overseen those programs in Minnesota. We have seen an enormous loss of our important taxpayer dollars. Feeding Our Future fraud scandal that we heard about was a situation where there were sites that were supposedly feeding kids where nobody could have fed them. And if Minnesota officials, including Attorney General Ellison's office, which was involved in litigation at that time, had just gone out and checked, they would have been able to find those problems.
And that's the part nobody in power wants regular people focusing on, because it's devastatingly simple. Go check. That's it. Not some galaxy brain theory of public administration. Not a 400-page task force memo. Go check whether the sites exist. Go check whether the numbers make sense. Go check whether the claims match reality. This is why the scandal resonates so deeply with the public. A lot of people hear explanations from officials and think, hold on, you're telling me all this money moved around, all these claims were made, and nobody bothered to verify obvious red flags in the real world. That's not just a policy failure, that's a culture failure. It suggests a governing culture more afraid of confrontation, bad headlines, internal friction, and political embarrassment than of fraud itself. And once that culture sets in, oversight becomes theatrical. Everybody says the right words. Everybody praises accountability in the abstract. Everybody loves protecting taxpayer dollars as a concept. But when it's time to do the uncomfortable, confrontational, unglamorous work of actually stopping abuse, suddenly the energy disappears. That's why this hearing matters beyond Minnesota. This isn't just one scandal in one state with one attorney general and one governor. This is a preview of what happens whenever huge streams of money move fast through a system that doesn't reward skepticism, doesn't punish negligence quickly enough, and lets officials hide inside technical limitations after the damage is done. And let's be honest about the political side too. Ellison tried to frame this as something that shouldn't become a campaign ad. In a perfect world, maybe. In the real world, of course it becomes political. It becomes political because voters use scandal to judge competence. They use responses like this to judge honesty. They use blame shifting to judge character. That's not unfair. That's democracy. Public office is not just about intentions. It's about outcomes, judgment, and whether people believe you were awake at the wheel. The deeper problem for Ellison is that the hearing didn't make him look like a man in command of the facts. It made him look like a man trying to narrow the definition of responsibility until he could fit comfortably outside it, and that almost never works on camera. Not when the stakes are this high, not when the money involved is this large, and definitely not when the person questioning you comes armed with your own words. At the end of the day, this is why that opening clip hits so hard. Under your watch is not just a line, it's the question every voter should ask when government fails this badly. Who was in charge? Who knew what? Who acted? Who didn't? And who is now pretending that responsibility is too complicated to pin down? Because the public is tired of the same script. Money disappears, officials minimize it, the scandal gets exposed. Everybody agrees fraud is terrible. Then the blame gets passed around like a hot potato until the story fades and the incentives stay exactly the same. That's what Senator Ernst tapped into here, and that's why Ellison's answer landed so awkwardly. The public doesn't want a seminar on jurisdiction after the fact. They want proof that somebody in authority treated their money like it mattered before the scandal exploded. Let me know what you think in the comments. Did Ernst expose a real failure of leadership here? Or do you think Ellison was being blamed for limits that came with the office? Hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.